today. Really kind of a special day for a couple of reasons. First, we're actually coming at you from a hotel room. This backdrop is a real backdrop that the ladies have taken one of our backdrops and like put it over the TV to give you not an illusion, the reality of the lion shield being right here looking out for you. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We've assembled probably like the best panelists that I could imagine for this really critically important discussion on the new FCC revocation rules. I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves here in a second, but I'm going to introduce them first in my own way. First, you've got Pooja Amin, of course, my incredible partner, best lawyer I've ever worked with, best lawyer I know, who also just happened to have worked at Loan Depot in a capacity that's relevant here. John Henson, one of the best lawyers not named Pooja that I know, who was, at some institutions like LendingTree and Consumer Affairs. And then some guy named AC, who's just like the CEO of, I don't know, one of the most innovative and important communications platforms in the world. And we're just here to talk to you about some little tiny earth-shattering, completely massive change to your contact strategy. So I'm glad you're all here. Why don't we throw it around and introduce ourselves? Pooja, start with you.
Hi, folks. Queenie here of TCPA World, also a partner at Trotman Amin. I handle both compliance and TCPA litigation at my firm, and previously I was in-house counsel, as Eric mentioned, at Loan Depot, where I oversaw all of their marketing and advertising compliance from a mortgage perspective and a TCPA perspective.
And apparently our chat is at capacity. I don't even know what that means. We'll get better at this over time, maybe. I don't know. John, introduce yourself.
So I'm John Henson. I am attorney at Trotman Amin. I've been here about 7 months, and prior to that, I was general counsel at Consumer Affairs, and then I was also at LendingTree for a while as well.
AC, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, Eric, thanks. AC, co-founder, CEO of drips.com.
Okay, you know what? That's fine.
Short and sweet. I don't have a good nickname yet. I'm working on it.
Way to be a topper, AC. But here's what you guys need to know, kind of at the highest level, stepping out. The commission, the FCC, has said that there's going to be a new way that the scope of revocation is going to be interpreted. And the outcome here, the outcome of these rules is going to dictate your strategy in terms of how you want to engage in outreach to begin with. Because the more outreach you engage in, the more opportunity there's going to be for a revocation to take place. And so you're going to have to be very thoughtful, because as you're about to hear, if the consumer revokes on a consented message, there's going to be one level of revocation depending on the kind of communication. If they revoke on a non-consented exempted message, it's going to be a complete revocation of all communication channels for all purposes. And that is a massive, massive change from today, where we can interpret a revocation consistently with the consumer's expectation. And if the consumer opts out for one purpose or in connection with one channel, you're probably only going to treat that revocation for that one purpose and that one channel. But that's all about the change. Pooja, why don't you give us a nice overview of the law to get us started?
Yeah, guys, so I've been hooting and hollering about this NPRM since the day it came out. I know a lot of us have been focused on the one-to-one consent rule, but understand this is going to be just as significant, if not even more significant than the one-to-one consent rule. And the implementation date is going to be April 11th, 2025. So it is coming up, it is creeping up, and there's a lot of changes, as we'll talk about here, that businesses are going to have to undertake in order to now comply with the new revocation rules. What has the FCC gone and done? So on a high level, right? Previously, revocation, right, you had a reasonable time to process any revocation request. So a consumer comes in, sends you a do not call request. Courts have looked at what a reasonable revocation time period was. A lot of people throw around 30 days rules. You process the revocation within 30 days. So number one, what the FCC has done, right? Initially, they had said that they were going to allow only 24 hours for you to process the revocation. Luckily, they came through to a middle ground standard where they have now said that 10 days. You have 10 days to process the DNC request from upon receipt of receiving that request. So that's change number one. Change number two, now, any revocation of any sort from any channel for all texts and calls where you have to acquire TCPA consent have to stop now. So now text equal calls and calls equal text, right? Courts have also looked at this, but the FCC has not firmly said that when a consumer says, stop calling me via text message, that is going to apply towards all channels. Number two, revocation in response to an exempt call or text message now revokes all texts and calls that are regulated by the TCPA. So what that means is if you get an opt-out to say a password reset, right? And the consumer says stop. Now that revocation is now going to apply to any kind of fraud notifications, any emergency notifications, all informational texts now and calls now have to stop. Now, lastly, a caller can provide a one-time text message confirming that the opt-out and asking the consumer to clarify the scope of their opt-out. But however, if the consumer does not respond to your confirmation text message, that means that that's going to be a full revocation. So those, on a high level, those are the new changes that the FCC has implemented, which is completely drastic from the current state of law.
Love
Yeah,
it.
Pooja, I was just going to say, like, to piggyback what you just said, I think what we're seeing with clients is a confusion that it's just related to telemarketing text messages, which is not the case. Two, there's a lack of understanding on that confirmation text of what that has to entail and what the results of that are. The fact that a consumer ignoring that confirmation text is a full revocation, I think people are underestimating that and not paying attention to that. And then additionally, the confirmation text, there's a lot of companies that aren't set up for that because the rule says if it's within a 5-minute time frame of the consumer says, take me off your list, and I don't respond within 5 minutes, it's arguably you're sending that text message without consent. And I think that is a drastic change going to be for a lot of people from a technical standard.
Yeah, so let's break down the different challenges here, guys, because I think we've got the law now, and I kind of just want to take this in buckets so we can really dive into each one of these issues, okay? Because as I'm looking at it, I see 4 distinct challenges, and there might be more, okay? So challenge number 1 is identifying what a consumer's intent signal, and so I'm going to turn this over to you, AC, because I know you guys are pros at this, when they are communicating with you. Now, in some instances, they're going to say stop. Okay, that's pretty clear. In other instances, they're going to use other phrases, right, that you're going to have to interpret and be able to ingest and interpret to determine whether or not that is a revocation under the law. And there's going to be a lot of nuance to that, all right? So, but that's challenge 1. It's just like ingesting free-form communications from a consumer and knowing what to do with it from a legal perspective. Challenge 1. Challenge 2 is completing the process of ingestion where you've identified what is likely to be a revocation into your system from all of the different output channels that you might have, communication channels you might have across text messaging, across phone calls, across email, across even like, somebody knocking on your door, handing you a note, coming in, when you try to order pizza or something, right? So all the different ways that you might communicate with the consumer, being able to take those signals that you first identified as potential revocation and then ingest them in some way. Then you have to be able to distribute, right, operationally, each one of those signals across all the different ways that you're ingesting according to the rules. And that's where we really have to break down step 3 is what are the rules, right? Where you've got a revocation signal from a different channel on a different purpose. How are those rules going to apply? Let's be very specific on that. And then how do you distribute that across all of your other platforms? And again, I keep thinking about enterprise where you've got originations and you've got servicing and they're different teams and they're using different systems. And how do you communicate this effectively between the two? And you've got other groups that are doing fraud detection, information security, and these groups might be operating completely on their own, right? These communications I think are critical. That's step 3. And then step 4 is what you just mentioned, John. The challenge around step 4 is confirmation messages, right? Trying to claw back some of the really difficult impact of these, very aggressive, shall I say, revocation presumptions that the FCC has put together to give the consumer to actually reorient the revocation to be more consistent with what they actually wanted, right? Because just at a high level, we're going to talk about some examples here in a second, but at a high level, if somebody's responding to a, MFA, because you're accessing a website with a new device, and so they send you a text message to your phone to confirm that this is really you, and you say stop to that MFA request, have you just opted out of all communications because that was an exempted communication? You just opted out to all communications, whether marketing, whether informational, whether consented or not? That seems to be what the rule says, right? So we've really kind of got to think about that 4th piece, like how do we save customer communication where the consumer plainly did not mean to opt out of all communication, right? And those are the 4 challenges, and that kind of leads to this meta 5th challenge, which is what I'm just so interested in, which is strategy, right? in light of these new rules, in light of these lower challenges, how do we set our calling function, our texting function across the different purposes and channels moving forward, right? And that's the ultimate question that hopefully we can provide some daylight on. But if it's okay, I'd like to kind of go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then talk about the big one here at the end. And on the first one, which is identifying what communications really do constitute revocation, which don't. AC, this is where, I mean, you've got so much experience with this. This has been a challenge that Drips, I think, with this natural language processing has just been like light years ahead of others.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the rule purports to use human standards now to judge revocation, right? Like if a jury or a judge would read something and understand that to be somebody saying they don't want to get messaged or called, yeah, you have to honor that. Previously to this, it was what was it? Stop, end, unsubscribe, cancel, revoke. I think those were kind of the 5 kind of keywords that every system would look for. As you know, Eric, we over the years built up a pretty massive NLP. We call it disqualified by Drips. Because we realized that, stop, end, unsubscribe, cancel wasn't enough, right? What if somebody typed stop and they did 4 O's, right? Or they said, leave me alone, or they said, stop blowing up my phone. Like to us, that was always a reasonable means. And because we're not natural language processing, we're not, not trying to be viewed as a chatbot. We started segmenting these, and we even bifurcate them to, explicits, right? People using swear words, things like that. People who we believe are opting out, right? They're saying, don't call me, take me off your list, leave me alone, stop blowing me up,
Right.
don't hit me up again, like whatever, any sort of, language you can think of. And then we have what we're calling closeouts now, which we previously called kind of not interested. So this is somebody's like, yeah, I already got my prescription, right? Or I already filled out that form, or I've already paid that bill. Like you want to stop messaging that person, but it's not a revocation of consent. And this is where it comes into what you're saying when it comes to strategy and the nuance behind all this, right, Eric? And then lastly, you have, like wrong numbers, like this isn't the right person. So some of these tags, right, an explicit or a wrong number, you probably don't want to clarify, right? Like if somebody just gave you the middle finger emojis and said, stop blowing me up, like, do you really want to give clarification to that person? Or if they said, this isn't puja, do you really want to say, okay, we've removed you from billing, but would you like to keep all other messages? So it's more than just, capturing reasonable means. You got to actually bifurcate reasonable means and decide, do you want to try to do clarification on those or not? And it's a terribly difficult thing. We did a study. We saw that Drips had 5.6 million unique ways that we removed people from a campaign. Now, some of these were closeouts, some of these were, opt-outs, some of these were explicits, but 5.6 million ways that somebody indicated they don't want to receive further messaging. So, just doing a keyword list isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I guess I hadn't fully even contemplated, because it's not just ingesting and identifying the intent signal for a valid revocation based on what a human being might view on the jury. It's also making the business decision of, depending on how those revocations might take place, what you want to do with it next, which isn't necessarily going to follow necessarily from the language of what the consumer said. That's actually really, I hadn't thought that all the way down. On this first problem, John and Pooja, what are we seeing right now? What do you think? What are tips and tricks for companies that are looking to process language and free form communications, both with agents live on the phone and via text?
Well, to me, the first thing you have to think about is, how are your systems talking to each other, right? So if you're at an organization like Wells Fargo, for instance, right, you're going to have so many different entities and different marketing groups and retail shops, et cetera. Are you using a system that can be processed all throughout your company? Because essentially you're going to make sure that your servicing department is now talking to your marketing department, right? And, utilizing solutions like Drips or any other like texting and calling platforms can process these DNC requests, and within 10 days, communicate those DNC requests all across your channels is going to be crucial, right? So step one is figuring out, how am I going to get everyone to talk to each other, right? Every department in my organization to be able to talk to each other. Step two is, to me, is going to be, what kind of text messages are going to be bucketed into, I want a confirmation text or I don't want a confirmation text, right? Back to AC's point, kind of looking at what the response is from the consumer, and then bucketing that into different buckets like hard red lines, no's, yeses, maybes, right? And just understanding every single script that is going on across your channels and under what you want to do with it, right? If you want to retain those consumers, if you want to kick them out completely. And then lastly, it's this informational piece is huge, right? A lot of organizations right now don't have to opt folks out when it comes to informational text messages. So that training is going to be completely new now, right? That your agents that are live on the calls, something that's informational, they may not process that at DNC, right? So getting everyone on board with these new rules, and if I'm in-house counsel, that's what I'm worried about the most, is training my agents properly and intelligently to understand these new rules.
So as you want to do, you've jumped ahead. We were just trying to focus on the first thing, but you've covered everything else. So we're done. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar. No, I'm just kidding. So John, coming back to the first issue though, right? Like what are the challenges and what are the solutions, tips, tricks, if we have any, for people to keep in mind when they're trying to determine either via text message or over phone calls, what's this person actually trying to accomplish, and how can we operationalize that, just ingesting kind of what they're saying in a free form context?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a lot of clients go back and have those manual reviews of, the text boxes, right? Like if it says opt out, we know it's an opt out. If it says stop, we know it's an opt out. What if it says, please never call me again, right? And so we're seeing a lot of clients realizing that if they do have that free-form text, someone has to look at that. So we're helping clients figure out how to do that and implement that. But that's got to be case one now, because it's not only is it a reasonable person, the caller, it's their burden of proof to show, no, that's unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's going to be difficult, in my opinion, is to say
it's really tough.
That's an unreasonable request.
And this reminds me of the old days in the TCPA world with the old opt-out evaders, right? You had the old EPS case, you had the heck's that fruit bouquet case. There's quite a few of these cases that would arise both in the voice channel and in the text communication, right? The text communication was classic, right? Because people, to your point, AC, we're only trying to honor, stop, revoke, the clear indications that, real consumers who actually don't want to receive communications know how to use. But these guys who are setting up lawsuits, and there's just tons of these people out there, they would say things like, sure would be great if perhaps I would no longer receive messages in the future, right? Something just plainly they were doing this.
It's reasonable.
System.
It's reasonable.
Right? You're right. It's absolutely reasonable, right? Maybe. I don't know. But in the old days, right, the opt-out evader cases, I remember the EPS case in particular, found that was unreasonable in the context of a consumer interacting with the text message, because they knew the consumer expectation was a stop would have sufficed, and the terms and conditions on the website and on the user agreement permitted only these revocation terms. In the new era, though, the new FCC rules, that's out the window. In my view, that's out the window. So
they specifically said that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
They specifically said you cannot make people respond with a specific keyword or keywords. So right. It's tough. I mean, and I agree with the serial litigator issue. I think, look, people that follow you and are in this industry, financial services, home services, banks, healthcare companies, insurances. I think everybody's probably up and aware of this because they're used to dealing with these types of cases, albeit differently, right, on the consent side. I worry about, like the retail companies and the pizza companies, right? Like we've talked about this before, Eric, but you order a pizza, right? Some companies, I think it's pretty cool. Pizza goes in the oven. They shoot you a text message letting you know the pizza goes in the oven, right? Just keeping you up to date on what's going on. I could send that reasonable. Yeah, I'd rather not hear anything else about this pizza. And then as soon as that thing pops out the other end of the oven, 6 minutes later, I got myself a nice easy, slam dunk TCPA case. If it was a reasonable means, right?
And that's exactly right. I mean, you think of, when you go to the mechanic, and this is going to get to problem 2 here, which Pooja, we're going to turn to you. Go to the mechanic, right? And, you're at your dealership, you take a car in, you get a text message saying, hey, your car's ready to go. I respond, stop, right? Well, if that consumer, or if that dealership had the right to contact me for other reasons, right? Well, that's gone now. It just got evaporated. Now, and again, that's assuming I say stop. But to your point, what if I say, thanks, I'll pick it up. Don't need to hear any more text on this, right? What result? How do you track that? What do you do? It's a fascinating little conundrum.
And how
So
do you
Pooja,
even understand it, right? Like John said, you can staff, right? And I've seen that. I've seen all the ways to deal with this, right? One is staff out. So you got literal people reading it, doing dispositions, right, Eric? So this was not a revocation. This is a revocation. That costs a lot of money and you got risk there if people do it wrong. You can leverage LLMs, right? So you can build something with ChatGPT. We're actually licensing our disqualified model for our clients and others in the industry, because the problem with the LLMs is you have to have enough training data for it to be accurate, right? You have to train these models to do it the right way, and unless you've had hundreds of millions or billions of conversations, it's tough to get there. The other thing I've seen that's interesting that I think people are going to do is a massive, unfortunately, overcorrection where they're either going to stop texting almost period, right? Like you think of like hospitals and things like that, that just as soon as one of them gets one of these cases, they're all going to stop until they find a solution. And then the second, still an overcorrection, but I believe people will do this, is they will respond once, right? So any message comes in, they will respond once saying, we can't understand your message, respond stop to stop, or respond confirm to stay. And then they have to just assume anything that doesn't come back with a confirm as a global opt-out. And I mean, think what that's going to do to people's lists. The collapse and combine that with the one-to-one rules, right? And it's going to destroy a lot of people's lists if they don't do this thoughtfully.
well, that's why I can't wait to get that last point. To me, that's the most interesting thing, right? The intersection between the revocation rule and the new one-to-one rule, which is, I mean, that's the Jedi level stuff. I can't wait to get there. But Pooja, so looking at the problems that we've identified, steps 2 and 3. Steps 2 are identifying all of your outreach channels so that you can determine how to ingest these communications effectively. And then 3, which is what you were getting at, training and disseminating the input signals and based upon the decision, the business rule that you're going to use to honor each of these revocations depending on how you're ingesting it, and then disseminate that right across all channels and across all agents. Though that is like the core challenge, right? Step 1 is you got to identify what they're saying, and that's AC's got vendor solutions and others do as well to help you with that. Very important. But then you ingest it and you disseminate it, and you've got to make sure you don't miss anything. How in the world does the enterprise do that, Pooja?
Well, one, hire TCPA counsel if you don't have anyone in-house. But honestly, Eric, it is extremely difficult. And in the beginning, businesses are really going to have to do some hand-holding and getting deep into the text message and calls that they're receiving when it comes from an opt-out perspective, right? Like, I want to remind folks that the FCC has stated now, stop to a marketing message because it's going to prevent any further calls or text messages unless you have a consent exemption. So now businesses are going to have to look at what consent exemptions may exist in their enterprise, right? And then they're going to have to now apply that and see if that applies. And if there's no consent exemption, then everything's going to have to stop all across all channels, right? And then more importantly, a stop to an informational message is going to revoke all the ability to message or call across all channels, marketing or informational. And so, I fear that a lot of folks are going to assume that they're going to have consent exemptions where they don't have consent exemptions. They're going to process informational text messages just to that one-time text message as opposed to every single informational text message that they send out across their organization. So, I think a lot of hand-holding, really getting the scripts of every text, whether it's on the marketing end or on the informational side. So if you're in a mortgage company, right, talking to your origination company and then also talking to your servicing company, just getting everyone on board is going to be the biggest difficulty that I see for large enterprises.
Yeah, so let's just remind ourselves of the waterfall here, right? So Pooja told you at the start, we know the timetable. The timetable is easy, 10 business days, right? As she told you, the FCC originally said 24 hours. Some business groups said 30 days. Reach comes in, Responsible Enterprises Against Consumer Harassment, and says, Commission, let's do an in-between approach. Let's do 10 business days. And of course, the Commission agreed with Reach, adopted the Reach proposal. And so 10 business days is the rule for honoring revocation. But we've got this waterfall, right? If the consumer is revoking to a marketing text, we know the impact of that is that all marketing across all channels must stop, but only marketing. Other kinds of consented communications, such as informational and non-consented required communications, can continue. Okay, so that's step 1. So so just put that away, because now you're thinking, all right, so if I get stopped to a marketing message, that's not that bad. It's only marketing that gets stopped. 2 informational messages. If an informational message goes out that requires express consent and the communication results in a revocation, then all consented informational and all marketing must stop across all channels and for all purposes. That's where it gets really, really hairy, right? You've got a relationship with your consumer. They've given you the phone number. They've requested communication for, account alerts or whatever else it's going to be. They respond stop to something that requires consent. Now every communication across any channel for that purpose, including marketing and informational, is gone. And then the third tier, which is the scariest of all, are exempted communications. These are communications that didn't even require consent to begin with, right? A fraud notification, MFA, you don't even need consent, right? You send those out, the consumer says stop. Wow, right? Amex sends me, because, I've got people all over the country using my Amex, right? Because we're a small firm. They take my card, and Tori was in DC last week, and the ladies were in Boca Raton, and I was in Las Vegas, right? And Amex all the time is sending me messages saying, "Hey, is this legitimate? You're getting charged in Boca Raton at the same time as in DC at the same time in Las Vegas on one card. How is that possible, right? Is this legitimate?" Now I'm fine with them, but what if I respond to stop to that, right? According to the new rule, Amex can no longer communicate with me ever again for any purpose, right? So this is like the challenge, right? This is the challenge. But so, John, coming back to you, looking at, again, how do we identify the communication channels that we've got to be looking at for ingestion purposes, and then how do we look at dissemination and training? John, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so I think one thing that has stood out to me in thinking about this is that the days of cookie cutter DNC policies and procedures are over, right? Because everybody wants to hold up their DNC policy and their DNC procedures and say, oh, we're in safe harbor. Well, what's going to happen is if you're not actively looking at every channel that you could possibly get a revocation in, then and documenting how that's going to happen, how are you actually training on those policies and procedures? Are they actually working? And if so, then if they're not, then you've just got this piece of paper that's not worth anything from a safe harbor protection standpoint. So you have to go review your DNC policies. You have to go review your DNC procedures. But Eric, while you were going through the waterfall, I also just had the thought of like, does this create a somewhat perverse incentive of now you just add marketing language to every text message? And so you have dual purpose messages. They're like, oh, no, wait. So it's like, oh, your car's ready. And don't forget to come check out our tire shop. Right?
Yeah.
So now
it's interesting.
So now I'm going to say stop to that. And then I can say, oh, well, that's just stop to a marketing message. Right?
Yeah. So I love that. That goes to like the strategy issue that we're going to get to at the end. Hold on to that. But that is exactly right. Right. That waterfall creates this weird incentive that actually, you're more incentivized from a strategy standpoint to do marketing than you are now to do informational, because the impact of a revocation is more narrow in one context than in the other. And you're least incentivized to send the most important messages of all, which are the fraud notifications and things that don't even require consent to begin with. Now that is like really interesting, but we got to get to that. So I see, I still want to just kind of talk. I don't think we really got to the center of what I'm trying to get to, right? Which is for enterprises in particular. These guys have, multiple different outreach channels, right? Servicing, debt collection, fraud, marketing. These people are not communicating with each other day to day, generally speaking. They have separate functions. They've got separate teams, separate data, separate call centers, separate dialers, right? How is a compliance person, an in-house legal person, and this might be tough for you, AC, but I know you've got a lot of visibility from your perch. How are they supposed to keep track of all these channels of communication, get them in line to abide, to John's point, one policy, right? One set of rules that they're all going to comply with when they all have competing, not just functions, but like literally competition with each other for people's phones. Yeah. And now they're going to be even more in competition. What is a stakeholder in law, in the legal department of an enterprise? What are you supposed to do? What do you think?
It's tough.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Sorry, John. Go ahead.
I was just saying, you have got to dig in and understand exactly what's working, exactly how it's working, and exactly who's doing it. And until you get everybody on the same page and on the same room, it's impossible. I mean, I've been in-house and tried to deal with 4 different contact centers, right? Like, it is a full-time job almost to deal with those processes and procedures. But you've got to be able to do that, and you have to have a master list somewhere, usually on an Excel sheet, that says these are all the ways that we talk to customers, these are all the ways they can opt out, these are all the ways that we have to respond to that. And that gets built into your new policy, which then has to be disseminated across the board. And the problem is, it's not necessarily like what I just described is a lot of work, right? But to your point, Eric, is it's almost more of a political work of letting people know, I understand marketing that you want to do this, but we have to take them off after 10 days. And that 10 days is going to be a very difficult thing to sell when we've been selling them for the last X number of years on reasonableness. It's reasonableness, right? Because marketing wants that one last bite at the apple, and you're not going to get that one last bite at the apple anymore.
AC, what do you see, man?
Yeah, I think to me, it's tough, right? The bigger the company, the harder this is. Like problem zero is even figuring out who's reaching out to all these people, right? Like some of the enterprises we work with have hundreds of thousands of employees, literally, right? 100 to 300 reasons they may reach out to people. Think of healthcare, right, Eric? Like how many reasons do people reach out for healthcare reasons? And most of those aren't under the HHS exemption, right? Like you need to do a care gap closure, if you need to do a health risk assessment, comprehensive medical review. Like these are all very legitimate reasons that these various different departments in these healthcare companies want to reach out. But they, to your point, they're all disparate lines of businesses. They have their own CEOs, right? They have their own dialers, call centers, data list, et cetera. So I see them doing it one of two ways. Most of these companies have attempted, and some of them have done a better job than others at having orchestration efforts, right? Like a centralized group, an orchestration group, or a campaign management type group, or systems like Adobe and whatnot to keep all this stuff together. That's on the orchestration side. So they either build it in-house, through Salesforce, things like that, which is pretty difficult, especially if they haven't already done it, or they look to systems like Possible Now to third party it, right? To say, all right, everybody has to post their preference management, their consents in and out into something like Possible Now. That needs to be tied into all the different CRMs, all the different electronic health record tools, pretty much everything, right? Because I think to y'all's point, no matter what channel you reach out, that is going to invite revocations back, right? I think somebody asked in the chat, and I'd like to get clarification on this, but the revocations are just for telephony. Is that accurate? Because I don't think this governs email. It doesn't govern direct mail, et cetera.
That's correct. So email, they can continue under this new rule. Now, there's other sets of rules regarding when emails have to stop. This rule would not impact that.
Right. So you have all these, omni-channel things reaching out, right? Like could somebody opt out from a web chat, right? Could they say, hey, they go to acme.com, they pop on the web chat, they're like, hey, you guys have been calling me, please stop, right? So you got to think of web chat somewhere it could come inbound, direct mail. I think we were talking earlier about handwritten letters slid under the door at a local branch. I mean, that's the really difficult thing, right? Is capturing all that stuff. But yeah, so I see them either using in-house internal, preference management type tools. But the problem with that is like these things aren't stratified enough, right? Like they generally will have, marketing and administrative. Now, unless you want to have all these big global opt-outs, you need to have very, very nuanced stratification under administrative so that, Eric, if we text you and it's a billing notice from Amex, right, you could say stop. And I go say, okay, Eric, we're going to take you off all billing notices. Respond, stay if you'd like to make sure you don't miss other important alerts, from Amex, including, fraud alerts, et cetera. And then you're like, okay, yeah, I don't mind fraud. I want fraud alerts, so I'm going to stay, right? But that means you have to have that stratification, right? Across all your different reasons you may reach out to somebody so that you're not just saying like stay, to keep all or stop to, lose all.
Yeah. So bottom line, those of you that are enterprise, like some of you are just like one function call center BPO, cool. All right. This is a lot easier for you, right? Those of you that are listening to me that are an enterprise, I mean, you're going to need a czar. And I actually don't mean Eric Troutman in this instance. I mean an internal czar, somebody at your institution that's going to say, look, these stakeholders across all these different outreach channels, functions at this organization, maybe there's different business lines, and each one of the business lines has their own striations, right? Somebody at the brand level, somebody, at the parent company level has got to take over and say, y'all are going to now run your communication strategy through me. And that is a tough job. And as far as I can tell, maybe it can be a team, it doesn't have to be like a single individual, but there needs to be an orientation between outreach groups within enterprise to a level that has never happened before. And that is what to me, the biggest change that the FCC's new rule is going to bring over time. And people aren't going to figure this out right away, right? I'm speaking, a lot of folks are like, what are you talking about? You give it 3-4 years, I guarantee you, every large enterprise in this country is going to have a point person for telecommunications, not for, telephony, not for dealing with carriers, but for dealing with the disparate needs of the different groups within that organization that are doing outreach. And that doesn't exist today, by and large. There's not like a head of telecommunications at these enterprises, but there's going to be, and this revocation rule is driving that forward. But to AC's last point, we're going to pivot now to this fourth challenge. And this is a challenge really where, not to be shameless, but I always am, where Troutman Amin can really help you, right? The fourth challenge is how and when do you deploy the confirmation stay messages in order to help that consumer to understand the impact of what they're about to do when they say stop to a message that they really don't intend to cease all communication across all channels for all purposes. Pooja, what do you got?
Well, I mean, it's going to have to go back to the initial text message, right? And what your goal is, and how you want to retain that specific text message you want to continue to send. So, being very crafty in your confirmation text message, it's going to have to, you're going to have to manually start crafting these confirmation text messages so they're worded to meet the goal that you want, the end goal, right? Whether it's you want the consumer to say, no, I'd like to continue to receive fraud messages, right? How are you going to word that confirmation text so the consumer understands and knows, and more importantly, actually responds to you, right? And a lot of consumers, like I look at my phone all the time and I'm like too lazy to text back unless I really want that notification, right? So being really clear in your confirmation text message to show the consumer, hey, you really, really need this. I know you need this because without it, you may miss a payment, or, you may not get the fraud notification because you're in DC when you want to use your credit card in Vegas, whatever it is, right? Whatever is important to the consumer and understanding who that consumer is, right? So I can foresee businesses looking at different buckets of consumers too, right? Like the folks that are just focused on marketing, right? The folks that have been account holders for 10, 15 years, right? Kind of assessing what types of text messages do these consumers already receive on a daily basis, right? Those consumers are likely want to continue to receive those because they're being sent out for a reason occasionally, and you probably don't want to stop receiving those, right? If it's someone like my mom, for instance, she needs constant reminders of when her payments due. Someone like me, I don't need constant reminders. I'll get irritated. So really understanding your consumer base and what type of text messages you are sending out from both the marketing and informational text message, and then crafting those confirmation text messages is going to be huge from a retention perspective.
Yeah, I mean, can you say something at the outset like critical, please read at the start of the text message so that consumers understand like, no, or time sensitive, please respond or something at the start of one of these messages?
Well, and that's another important piece, right? You can't have any sort of marketing or do anything to persuade the consumer or change their mind about their opt-out, right? So to me, that's going to blur the lines, right, of the guidance that the FCC has put out there saying that you can't convince or try to persuade the consumer to change their mind, right? It has to be a very direct, non-marketing text message that you are sending to the consumer, almost like having a conversation, right? But a very basic, easy, comprehensible confirmation text where the consumer doesn't feel pressured into changing their opt-out request.
John, what do you think, man? Do we have tips and tricks yet for our clients on this? This is new, this is innovative, but I really feel like Troutman Amin is going to be able to add a lot of value here on this piece.
Yeah, I think the key is that crafting of the message, right? And making sure that you're being very specific on what you're marketing, what you're opting out of. And again, I think Pooja also just hit on something that's very underappreciated in this regulation, which is that you can't persuade people, right? And you can't say, you really don't want to do that because you'll miss out on this, this, and this. Like realistically, like that's informational. Say if you unsubscribe, you're going to miss out on, payment updates. You're going to miss out on billing cycle information. But is that persuading? Possibly, right? But that, like, again, that's like information the consumer needs to know.
But how can you clarify without rebutting, right? Because this is basically a no rebuttal rule, is essentially what it is. And yet it's also, clear thanks to Capital One and the great petition by the Kingmaker. By the way, Jeremy Gladstone was the guy behind that petition that gave us this little breathing room. Under the language of the ruling, right, you are allowed to clarify with that consumer. But by the same token, you're not allowed to basically rebut and to have them try to change their mind. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be language that says you are opting out of pure marketing messages from Domino's Pizza, right? Or you're opting out of this information. You will still receive X, Y, and Z, right? And then you say confirm to confirm this opt out, stop to opt out of everything. And then you can see what the consumer does. And I think you're also going to want to, Eric, to your point, is you're going to want to track that opt-out rate. And I think we'll see a lot of testing in this language because this is an area that it is an area that is ripe for making sure that extra 1% of confirm, the extra 1% of a consumer actually responding back to that text message can make a large difference.
Mm-hmm. Pooja, earlier this year, you were on stage at a TCPA summit, and you had great slides up with very specific examples of these non-rebuttal, clarification messages. I mean, do you have any kind of pointers that you can share right now? I know that we've developed, quite a bit of know-how around this already.
Yeah, so let's just take the classic example, right? Your bank sends out a fraud notification, and at the end of it says, respond, stop if you wish to no longer get fraud notices, for instance, right? And the consumer says, stop. Now you want to send a clarification message. So for instance, say the business says, understood, please confirm your request to be removed from fraud notifications. Now, is that confirmation text going to be compliant under the new rules? To me, looking at that, when the consumer said stop, the opt-out notification had already said, respond stop if you no longer receive fraud notifications. I already told you stop. So why are you now sending me a confirmation text message for me to confirm that I did not want to leave fraud notifications, right? So that is something classically that I think plaintiffs' attorneys are going to look at and kind of nitpick and really hold the business responsible for the clarification text message to make sure they are being compliant by not persuading the consumer to do something they already were very clear when they responded stop. So again, like I said, like going back to what the original message said is really going to impact how your confirmation text message is going to have to be worded, right? Well, I understand the TCPA does not require you to provide opt-out notifications. A lot of businesses and entities do, which is a good thing because now you can take those opt-out notifications in the original text message and word it in such a way that can assist you in sending the confirmation text message. So I do have a bunch of great examples I'll probably put up on TCPA World, but again, the reason why those examples exist because there's going to be so many different types of examples, and it's going to be an enterprise by enterprise level inspection as opposed to, hey, these are the one-to-one consent rules. This is what everyone should be doing. There's not going to be an umbrella approach to this. Every organization is going to have to look specifically at every text message that is going out.
And
but wouldn't we want the reply confirmation just something like? I mean, I understand there's tension, but I mean, shouldn't it say something like to stop only fraud alerts, press 1, to stop all communications for all purposes from Amex, press 2. I mean,
I think that's one way to do it.
Give that option. I mean, again, it is just one way. There's a million ways to skin this cat. But go ahead, AC, jump in.
Well, yeah, no, I think you could do that. I think to John's point earlier, this is going to be something that's going to be heavily tested, right? People are going to figure out what's the legal. I look at it like it's got to be factual clarification without persuasion, right? So you got to, if you could state, please respond, confirm to be removed from billing notices. Otherwise, you will miss, other alerts about your account as an X, Y, and Z. Like that's a factual thing, right? Is that persuasion? I don't know. We'll work with y'all and others to make sure, right? But it's to me, it's factual and it's not persuasive. I don't want to. You couldn't say, because otherwise you will miss, super important, things that could affect your credit, right? Because now I'm trying to sell somebody onto the fact of it, right? But yeah, I mean, Pooja, like it starts with this is to me this whole problem. Like there's the technical problem, right, which is like figuring out who's doing the reach out, how are they bifurcating things, how is the data all the data interoperability issue, right, is the big one. Then it's just all about strategy, and what we've been doing with our clients is doing an outreach audit, like where we say any telephonic, regulated technology you're using, please fill in this sheet, right? So you're doing power dialers, auto dialers, triggered text messages, drips campaigns, whatever it is, like fill this out. And then we start asking them, okay, how important is this campaign on a 1 to 10, right? So then you got a kind of an outreach audit, so you can start to figure out, like, because to me the trick here is stop opt-outs before they start. As soon as somebody opts out, they're 1 foot out the door, right? Mm-hmm. And your chance of losing them is pretty high. So we're trying to help companies figure out, okay, like which one of these outreaches are superfluous, right? They were nice to have before, but they in this new world they shouldn't be doing it. Then a really, really nuanced stratification of campaigns, health risk assessments, comprehensive medical reviews, Medicaid redetermination. One of these is much more important than the others, right? And every year, due to CMS, STARS rules and cut rates and whatnot, those importance change, right? So you have to have a pretty nuanced thought process on what's priority versus what's not priority. Get less messages out, and then I think the key, this is a little self-fulfilling, but is conversations, right? If you're having good conversations via automations like drips or through human agents, you can invite closeouts. Hey Eric, we got prescriptions ready to be picked up. Let us know if you already picked it up, right? Something like that, right? And if they say, yeah, I already picked it up, okay, great. I'm going to stop messaging. I'm going to close them out, right?
Smart.
It's not a revocation, right?
Very smart.
So some stopping the opt-outs before they start, right? I think that's really what companies got to start thinking about.
Well said. Well
See,
said.
that's next level stuff, man. That's why we have you here. Stop opt-outs before they start. That's a beautiful phrase, but then when you put the context around it, you just gave that great example. Brilliant stuff. But can we, lawyers, are we comfortable deriving a rule right now, or do we need time around that it's okay to rebut by informing the consumer of other channels and information they might lose, but it's not okay to rebut regarding the specific one that they've actually just opted out to? Again, using the Amex example of, I want to stop the fraud notification, press 1 to opt out of only fraud notifications, no rebuttal. Press 2 to opt out of all communications from Amex and lose communications regarding, account alerts or other items that you might care about from Amex. Are we comfortable at this stage saying you can essentially sell the other kinds of communications that the consumer might want to receive unrelated to the specific message that they stopped? Or do we feel like, no, you can't even do that? Because I'm leaning toward that. I'm going to be honest with you, but it's early, so I don't know. What do you guys think?
I'm leaning the other way. So
okay.
I would say, using your example, I think is bad. Meaning, like, I would never recommend that. What I would say is press 1 to lose fraud alerts, press 2 to lose all marketing, all information, including blah, 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 instead of and lose. That's different, right? Lose makes it sound like it's much more negative. It is.
Yeah. That's why I was doing it.
More persuasive, right? But if I say including, at least that point, I'm telling the consumer, I wrote down on my paper here, factual clarification without persuasion, that AC said, because like that is so perfect, I think, because that is a factual clarification that you're losing, on your Amex card, point notifications or reward notifications, but in not a way that's persuading.
Pooja, where do you fall?
So I think as long as you are using that approach before the opt-out message, right? So the first text message you send, and then you send an opt-out notification, for instance, saying, respond, stop if you wish to no longer receive fraud notices, or you can respond, unsubscribe, right? Using some softer language to be removed from all other important notices. Keep it very vague and broad. And that message is going out before any type of opt-out even has been received on your end. That is completely fine. right? You already have the consent to send the text message, you're fine. And then the consumer says, stop, right? At that point, you can stop you receiving the fraud notifications, right? But if the consumer says unsubscribe, right, then they're presumably asking to be removed from all important notices. Then that's when you can come in and put in that clarification message saying, are you sure now you're going to lose information on X, Y, and Z? Because that falls in within the bucket of those important notifications. And I think that is perfectly fine under the law as it's written. I don't know what case law is going to, what it's going to dictate, but I think that would be perfectly okay.
I love the way Pooja finds a way to come right in between. I love that. So AC says stop revocations before they start. Pooja says stop clarifications before they start. I think that's great.
I'm curious on double clicking on that just for a second, Pooja, and where I land on it, by the way, is like I said, factual clarification is without persuasion. Like, as long as, to me, if what you're saying is accurate and under UDAP and whatnot, like, as long as it's accurate and you're not obviously selling them on staying, like, that's where I see most companies landing. They're saying other important messages or account alerts, things like that. Because the other problem, John, is, Amex may be a simple example, but think of healthcare. There's literally 100 different reasons that people may need to be reached out to, right? Redeterminations, renewals, whatever, billing. I mean, there's so many, you couldn't list them all, right? So
there's a 3-tier exemption to healthcare as well, by the way, just to add a layer of complexity there.
Right, exactly. So on what you were saying though, Pooja, are you saying that people can clarify before they get the chance to send the clarification? So example, I could say, hey, this is a fraud alert, response stop to be removed from all fraud alerts, or respond unsubscribe all to be removed from all outreach. Like you're saying, you can do the clarification presumably before they do an opt out, and then if they say stop, you can keep it clarified to just the fraud alerts.
Yeah, as long as that's not the only means that they can opt out, right? So they can still presumably call in and opt out, but I don't see why you can't include that message in the initial fraud alert, right? It's very similar to how most businesses already do it, right? They send out a message and say, reply Y to continue receive, or to Y to confirm, right? Those messages are already being tacked on to most folks that are using the text message space, but I don't see why you can't within the initial fraud message.
Yeah. What Pooja's saying, I mean, you said what you're saying, but the way I look at what Pooja's saying is you can't dictate how a consumer can opt out, but you can dictate if they choose to use a specific word, what that word means in the context of your communications. So for instance, if you say, respond, stop fraud alerts, and unsubscribe to stop all communications, that doesn't prevent the consumer from saying, quit, leave me alone. And then you have to treat that, going back to the original challenge, how do you ingest that, right? You've given
you can
them,
suggest, you can't dictate, right?
Exactly, right? So they say quit. So now you've got to have a strategy play, right? What do I do with quit? We know if they said stop or if they said unsubscribe, what we would do. But now for other free-form entries that might be an intent signal around revocation, what do we do? And that goes back to your point of strategy, right? But that's what Pooja's saying. Lead them, lead the consumer to water to help them so that you don't have to clarify. If the consumer rejects the water, fine, you're back in the situation where you have to solve for it. But if they follow your lead, then at least it's just fraud alerts. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that.
Yeah, and AC Drips probably has a lot of analytics on that. I'm actually really curious, right? Like testing that out. If you lead the consumer, how many consumers are, setting aside plaintiffs, serial litigators, how many consumers will go out and send something different? Right. I am very curious.
Yeah. A lot, unfortunately. I mean, the problem is it's not that it's the large percent of them, but even a small percent is a lot to get wrong. Right. I mean, I think that's the biggest problem. So even if it's 5, 6, 7% of people that won't spell it specifically perfectly so that a machine can read it, it's like, what do you do with that 5% of people when you're getting thousands of messages in a day? It's just a lot to navigate. I have a quick question, and I think I saw this in the chat team. So somebody revokes, let's just say they revoke partial administrative consent, but then they come back in and they renew and they set up a new policy with a healthcare company. Does that give, is it superseded? Is it new levels of consent, or they revoked marketing and they come back in and they go back in for a new quote and they give a new consent?
So mercifully, these rules are not going to impact the existing rules around reconsent. So if your consent is revoked, you can still get renewed consent at whatever level, depending on what kind of message you're going to be sending, is required. So for instance, if it's marketing, you can still obtain new express written consent. If it's informational messaging, if you interact again and create a new account, then you can now communicate on that new number on that new account, even if the previous revocation took place. So it should, the challenge is in the revocation piece. It's not in the re-consent piece. But we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to finally get to strategy, right? We've gone through the challenges. Now let's talk, recognizing these strategies. Let's pretend, 30 days, 3 years, 6 years, whatever it is from now, each of us are the czar, right? We're the communications chief at one of these massive, call it a healthcare enterprise, right? A Fortune 10 company with a bunch of different disparate call centers and impacts. How do you view calling strategy? And I know this is way above the pay grade for regular lawyers, but I love this like thought experiment, right? Because I know where I'm going to come down, and I kind of want to hear from everyone else. And I don't think it's as easy, AC, as you send out a survey and ask all your business leads, how important are these communications to you? Because they're all going to say 10, right? So you're going to have to gore somebody's ox. So how do you do that? AC, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with knowing what's going on, right? So that outreach audit. And I think, to your point, ruthless prioritization, which I believe that you're right. There's going to have to be somebody in the middle of the organization that's non-biased, right? Like they're there just to make sure that the important messages are going out. And again, for like as an example for healthcare, this changes, right? It changes every year with CMS and stars and everything, right? So ruthless prioritization, then stopping opt-outs before they start, right? So really thoughtful outreach, communication that doesn't invite a ton of revocations, less messages, thoughtful closeouts. We talked about the factual clarification without persuasion. And then I think last is having a tool or a system or a way to do manual outreach when necessary. Because that's the other thing, right, Eric, is this is for regulated technologies. It's not for unregulated technologies, a hand dial, initiate by drips, a hand text, safe select, tools like that. So having those when necessary.
That's right. So that's the interesting question, right? And that requires further research, because if it's a marketing message or a consented message that they opt out of, yes, you can pivot to drips initiate and still continue to have those communications. I'm not so sure if it's an exempted, non-consented message that they opt out to, the fraud alert. I'm not so sure you can continue to communicate even with initiate.
If it was previously exempted. Yeah, that's a good point.
I want to research that. But that's a really interesting question. I'm going to throw it over to you, John. High level strategy. You're the czar of a major enterprise.
Yeah.
How do you split these babies?
I mean, AC's right again when he said it's ruthless prioritization, right? And it's not as simple as, we get X number of texts that drive Y revenue, right? It's like, is it the right revenue, right? I've said before, being good in-house counsel is understanding what pays your salary, right? And you have to understand the business of what drives the business importantly, and it's not always just revenue. It could be, this is an important customer base. This is an important service we provide. This is our main service. We have to grow this, right? So you have to do that prioritization. And then also, I think you have to have a great understanding of how your systems are talking to each other, because without that, it doesn't matter. Because you're not getting the right prioritization because you don't have the right data, right?
Pooja, I know you're fighting with poor James right now, but are you able to weigh in? How you guys are giving me ruthless prioritization, but you're not giving me your ruthless prioritization. What do you think, Pooja? How are you prioritizing, or do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I think all of it's priority, right? I think honoring the
cop out. You don't get to say everything's priority. That's the challenge.
It's not a cop-out, because one mistake with any of these new rules, you're facing $500 up to $1,500 a violation, right? So any of these new rules can get you in trouble. Not following the 10-day rule, right? Something as simple as that. Not following a reasonable revocation, whatever that reasonable word is going to be interpreted by the courts, right? So just finding that fine line of, allowing your business to continue, obviously, marketing and reaching out to their consumers, but looking at, I also think looking at previous case law, right, and how the courts have already looked at revocation to begin with, and kind of applying that to your standard, being as conservative as possible to start, right, with honoring reasonable revocation. I think that one's a huge, right? If someone gives you a middle finger, that's going to be revocation, right? No longer are you going to be able to rely on these basic words that most companies do. And I think that's the biggest the easiest way to get sued is not following those words. But then I think lower priority, fine, I will give you my answer. I think lower priority is going to be how you're going to draft those opt-out notifications and the confirmation text messages.
So we're talking about prioritization of calling functions, and we're out of time, so I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
This is the way I see it. Legally required communications have to be preserved at all costs. So every other function of your enterprise is going to have to suffer for legally required communications first. Second, in my view, communications that are required to tether and maintain a relationship with the consumer, such as servicing notifications that keep the consumer happy and informed about the status of their account, have to come second. To me, there's a bunch of other gray in between. The last one, in my eye, is marketing to existing customers. To me, that gets jettisoned for the reasons we've discussed. But you replace that with a hearty reliance on one-to-one valid new consents. Because if you burn those, you don't burn the rest of your list. You don't burn the rest of the communications in your portal. So that would be, again, where 6 months ahead of where you even have to start really thinking about this, but you really have to start thinking about it now. But we're probably a year ahead of major institutions and really kind of analyzing it. But from the czar's eye, that's how I would do this, right? Legally required, maintain existing relationships, a bunch of other gray stuff. You figure it out according to the philosophy of your enterprise. And to John's point, what's important to your business. And then last but not least is I would not send marketing messages to my list of my existing customers ever again. I would just go to third-party one-to-one consent that are valid one-to-one consents and only communicate there because if revocation takes place, it's siloed. It's just that communication. That's it, folks. Hope that you enjoyed this. I think this was a rocking good time. I know I had fun, and I think there's a lot of stuff to do with your beautiful day. Be sure, of course, to follow TCPA World. Follow our wonderful Deserve to Win YouTube channel. We have so much great content. Get a copy of our TCPA 2024 annual review, sponsored by the good folks over at Contact Center Compliance. And we love you. We'll chat soon. Bye, everyone.